I have been keeping an eye on the Microsoft form, and quite a few of you have asked for a recap of the 1930s, and so that is what I shall give you. We'll talk about the politics of the 1930s, the establishment of the national government, we'll talk about the economy, and we'll talk a little bit about 1930s society and living standards and stuff like that. I've got no idea how long this will be. This is quite a chunky section of the course. So you might want to watch this in a couple of bursts, depending on how long I end up talking for. I'm not talking about Neville Chamberlain and appeasement in this. So really this stops in terms of like politics, it stops in 1937, after Baldwin. I can do something on Neville Chamberlain if that is something that you would find useful, but I didn't want to make this even more of a behemoth than it already is. Anyway, so you will recognise the man on the screen. That is Clement Attlee, leader of Labour since 1935, and he is talking about here something which he refers to as the greatest betrayal in the political history of this country. So if you're thinking, well, what is Attlee talking about? Why does he have this opinion? What he's talking about is the creation of the national government in August 1931 under Ramsay MacDonald. And we know that Attlee has this opinion that Ramsay MacDonald has betrayed his people, he's betrayed his cabinet, he's betrayed his party, and he's betrayed the ordinary working man because of his getting in bed with the Conservatives, led by Baldwin, but also the acceptance of the recommendations of the May Committee from July 1931, which we'll go through in a second. So, in terms of where Britain is up to, by the time that the Wall Street crash happens in October 1929, and then by the time of the need for the creation of the national government in August 31, there is a huge deficit in the government budget by 1930. There is a deficit of £14.5 million, and that is primarily because the government is spending too much and its income has gone down. And part of the reason that the government is spending too much is because of reduced tax revenue. So we know that obviously between the First and the Second World War, so between about 1918 and 1940, unemployment never dropped below 1 million. Obviously the Second World War obviously the Second World War starts in September 39, but don't think that we hit full employment just immediately as soon as the Second World War starts, because obviously that's not true. Anyway, so between 18 and 40, we have the intractable million, so the 1 million people that are unemployed, and by 1930, this is reaching a peak of about 2 million people unemployed, and a lot of those people are claiming national insurance unemployment benefit. And if you have a bunch of people who are unemployed and are not paying tax and are receiving unemployment benefit from the government, that means government expenditure is having to go up massively, but that sort of vacuum, if you like, of money isn't being refilled. The pot isn't being refilled. Now, something else that has made the debt worse is £100 million is spent on public works programmes in 3 years, so between 1929 and 1931. And this is Keynesian economics in action, right? So public works, create jobs, stimulate the economy. These people who have jobs, sorry, I've got the hiccups. These people who have jobs are going to then use their wages in the broader economy. They're going to buy stuff, they're going to pay tax, and that's going to stimulate the economy even further. So they're buying stuff from like privately owned companies. Those companies then pay tax to the government and blah, 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 blah. But in the short term, this creates a huge amount of government spending, and the benefits of this type of economic program aren't seen for quite a couple of years. So unfortunately, this is just very badly timed. We also have the extension and the raising of the widow's pension and the extension of free birth control to married women. So this is fantastic. Obviously, it's preventing women from having to go through unwanted copious pregnancies and having to have lots of babies and stuff like that. And this contributes to the falling of the birth rate in the 1930s and the average family size dropping quite significantly in the 1930s. But obviously this also costs money. So everything that Ramsay MacDonald is doing makes sense from the perspective that he is a Labour he's a Labour Prime Minister and blah, 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 blah. He's helping the working classes and trying to provide a cushion for their economic well-being and stuff like that. But it's all incredibly expensive. And this ends up spooking the international investors in the British economy. So in June 1931, I might have said July earlier. I did not mean July if I said July. June 1931, we have the publishing of the... Is it June or July? I'm having a crisis now. I thought it was July. It is July. I don't know why it says June on the screen. That's my bad. Anyway, in July 1931, we have the publishing of the May Committee report. It's named after George May, so it's not the May Committee because it publishes in May. It's published in July. Anyway, so basically what the May Committee says is the government is spending too much money. There are more job seekers than jobs available. And this is down to the ever-present beast of structural unemployment, which is incredibly tricky to fix. And the May Committee recommends an 11.5% cut in unemployment benefits. The Labour Party rejects this. So the Labour cabinet rejects this. And the biggest noise in the anti-May Commission camp is Arthur Henderson. MacDonald and his Chancellor Snowdon are not opposed to the recommendations of the May Committee on like a pragmatic, practical level. It would be wrong to say that MacDonald is supportive of the May Committee on an ideological level. I think his support of the May Committee's recommendations comes from a pragmatic level. But he is in favour of implementing the restrictions and the cuts in public spending. So this then leads to the crisis in the Labour Party. And we see a bunch of Labour MPs basically refusing to work with the Prime Minister if he is intending on implementing the cuts recommended in the May Committee report. So MacDonald goes, okay, I've lost control of the party. I've lost control of, not lost control of the country necessarily, but I've lost control of the party. I've lost my mandate amongst my fellow MPs. I'm going to go to Buckingham Palace. I'm going to speak to the King, George V, and I'm going to resign. But when he gets there, he finds, oh, look, Baldwin's there. Herbert Samuel, the leader of the Liberal Party, is there. Whatever could this mean? So basically what ends up happening is these three leaders of the major political parties end up forming a national government, which is a coalition government. In terms of why MacDonald is pressured to form this national government, there's a couple of different reasons. And there's a bunch of different people that have a vested interest in the creation of the national government. So the first person that has a vested interest is King George V. King George V sees the economic crisis as tantamount to basically war, and he believes that the country needs to be politically strong and stable, to quote Theresa May. George V believes that the country needs to be politically stable to survive this political and economic crisis. So he says to MacDonald, we need a semblance of political unity. Everybody's going to need to work together in the same way that you all worked together in the First World War. We also have Stanley Baldwin. Baldwin has a very negative perception of coalition governments going back to the David Lloyd George coalition of 1918 to 1922. Baldwin is not supportive of the David Lloyd George coalition. Remember that he says that Lloyd George is a dynamic personality, but he basically destroyed the Liberals. And he was worried that Lloyd George was going to do the same thing to the Conservative Party. So Baldwin does not feel massively positive about coalitions at all, but he does see this as a way to get the Conservatives to have more influence in government policy. But what you need to know is that Baldwin's intention with joining the national government is that it will never be it won't be permanent. So his intention is, once the economic crisis is dealt with, that the Tories will then pull out of the national government. We've also got Neville Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain was the health secretary in Baldwin's second government between 24 and 29. He does things like widows' pensions, builds on the Wheatley Housing Act, which was built on his 1923 Housing Act, and he lowers the pensionable age and stuff like that. Neville Chamberlain also sees this as an opportunity for the Conservatives to get back into power and be able to influence government decision-making. But Chamberlain also has quite a lot of office hunger by this point. He is keen... Really, Chamberlain wants the big job, and he's hoping that if the Conservatives get back into government and he gets a important job in the coalition cabinet or the national government cabinet, then that will get him closer to his goal of being prime minister. Foreign confidence also plays a massive role in this, and what I mean by foreign confidence is the confidence of international economies in the pound. So basically, the government and the king are worried that if there's an election at this time, it's going to make Britain look completely unstable and look like it's kind of losing control of both, politics and the economy, and they're concerned that this will trigger a run on the pound or a significant withdrawal of foreign investment from the British economy. A bunch of international banks and lenders and stuff like that are already threatening to pull out of the British economy because Britain is spending too much on welfare. So foreign confidence and maintaining foreign confidence in the British economy plays such an important role in the creation of the national government. Now, we also have Herbert Samuel. Herbert Samuel is the leader of the Liberal Party at this point. He is... he's not as dynamic as David Lloyd George, but that's not a bad thing. David Lloyd George is quite poorly by this point, although he keeps trucking on until 1947. I think. Anyway, so Herbert Samuel sees this as the opportunity for the Liberals to get back into power and be able to influence government decision-making again, because obviously the Liberals were mired in the split going all the way back to December 1916, and basically Lloyd George usurping Asquith, if you want to phrase it like that. And public mood. So public mood is supportive of the national government, as we'll see in a second with the results of the October 1931 election. And the public really don't want the government to be seen as unstable. And they are supportive of all of the major three parties working together, because they are, as you can imagine, a huge percentage of the population by this point are quite scared about how... their lives are going to be impacted by the economic depression, because the press are really painting this as a catastrophe that is kind of comparable to the impact of war on the economy. Anyway, so MacDonald goes to the palace. George V says, we need to form a national government. You're going to be prime minister. MacDonald goes, okay. And when he goes to the cabinet meeting, this is the first time that he actually says to his cabinet, hey guys, I have created the national government under the request of the king. And he phrases it very diplomatically, very much like the politician that he is. And he says, I'm putting country before party and blah, 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 blah. But this gets a huge amount of criticism because he uses quite clumsy wording. And he says that he's putting, if you can hear sniffing, that's my dog. He's here to learn about Ramsay MacDonald and the creation of the national government. But he just yawned, so he's obviously really bored. Anyway, he says a clumsy phrase where he says that he is defending the creation of the national government because the economic crisis was caused by financial circumstance and not banker malice. So he's basically saying that it's not the bankers' fault that this global economic crisis has happened. It's not the bankers on Wall Street's fault that, little Susan can't afford her bread and stuff like that. And this goes down like a cup of cold sick to the Labour cabinet, who are like, it's not a massively positive look when you have the Labour Party Prime Minister defending the capitalist bankers instead of trying to make the lives of the ordinary people better. Anyway, so the Labour Party are infuriated. Henderson and 9 other Labour Party cabinet members resign, and MacDonald, Snowdon, Thomas and Sankey all enter the national government, and they are kicked out of the Labour Party. And people like Henderson see this as a purification of Labour. So from 1931, Henderson is the leader of Labour until he loses his seat. Anyway, now, I'm not going to talk about this too much because otherwise this video is going to get huge, but you can... Yes. Anyway, so when MacDonald becomes Prime Minister of the national government, he promises that he's not going to call an election, but actually he calls an election, 3 months after he becomes Prime Minister. So the general election of late 1931 gets the sort of nickname of having a doctor's mandate. What Ramsay MacDonald and the national government say to the ordinary people of Britain is, vote for us. Your life is not going to seem like it's improving initially. In some ways, your life might seem like it's getting harder because we're having to restrict government spending, restrict welfare spending, etc., etc. But if you vote for us, over time, your standard of living will improve. So a doctor's mandate is basically, the way I'd explained it was when you go to the doctor and they give you a really horrible tasting medicine, it's like, oh, this is disgusting in the short term. But in the long term, it makes you feel better. That is what the government is promising the people of Britain. And it works. People vote for them. So the Labour Party have basically disappeared out of existence. That's not true. But their seats have gone down massively. So in 1929, they have 288 seats. In 1931, it's 52. So they've lost over 200 seats, which is catastrophic. And the national government have 554 seats. They've got 67% of the raw vote. That is extraordinary. The people of Britain have given them the doctor's mandate that they asked for. So, I've already talked about that. So Baldwin is not keen on the national government. He's not keen on being in the national government. He says that the Conservative membership of the national government's temporary until the economy is stabilised. But they do see it as an opportunity to introduce protectionism. So remember, Baldwin wants to introduce protectionism in 1923. And that's why he loses that election to Ramsay MacDonald. And that also explains why he brings in Churchill as his Chancellor in 25. Not 25, sorry, that's gold standard. Why he brings Churchill in as his Chancellor in 24, because Churchill's a free trader. And Baldwin wanted to make it clear that he was listening to the public in their sort of dislike of protectionism. Anyway, so this time Baldwin goes, okay, this is an opportunity for me to reintroduce protectionism, and that happens in 1932 with Neville Chamberlain, who very satisfyingly is the son of Joseph Chamberlain, who wanted to introduce tariff reform in 1903. Anyway, so like I say, Labour have basically experienced a car crash. They've lost 4 out of 5 of their seats. Henderson actually loses his own seat, and a bunch of former Liberal voters, instead of swinging to Labour like you might expect them to do, they actually swing to the national government, which kind of implies that they're more swinging towards the Conservatives than anything else. The other problem is the female vote. So women's votes in the 1930s are more volatile than men's votes, especially because a lot of women who traditionally would have voted Labour, or would have voted Labour since 1918 when they were actually allowed to vote, voted Labour not through any sort of ideological loyalty, but because their husbands voted Labour. Because obviously we know that the Labour Party has a significant trade union representation, and we know that the trade unions are actually incredibly hostile to female workers and women in general. So a lot of women don't feel particularly loyal to the Labour Party. Anyway, so that kind of explains why Labour lose over 200 seats. When tariff reform is introduced by Neville Chamberlain in 1932, which you can either refer to it as like tariffs or protectionism, whatever you want to call it. Basically, that ends up splitting the Liberals again. So they're split in 1916 with Asquith and David Lloyd George, and then they're split again in 1932 with the introduction of tariffs. Herbert Samuel, the leader of the Liberals, who brought the Liberals into the national government in 1931, hates tariffs. He is a free trader. And so Herbert Samuel and a bunch of free trading Liberals leave the national government after only being in it for a year. And then the Liberals are then led by Sir John Simon, but there's like 5 of them. So the Liberals have basically died. And this is where we see the Liberals really losing any chance at a political revival at all from, well, I would argue from 1916, personally. But the Liberals are never, ever close to holding a government or holding... what am I even trying to say? They're never close to actually being able to form the party of government again. Because we know that in the 1950s, in the 1955 election, the Liberals get 2 seats. They're basically a corpse of their former selves, and it's, is it sad? I don't really care. Anyway, so in terms of the summary of the national government's economic policies then, one of the first things that the national government does in September 1931 is come off the gold standard. This results in the value of the pound falling by 30%. The dollar goes from the pound goes from being worth $4.86 to being worth $3.40, which is a significant drop. There's a huge emphasis on balancing the budget, so government expenditure and income matching, basically. And we see the dropping of unemployment benefit by 10%. We see the introduction of the repressive means test in 1931. And wages are cut in the public sector. Remember, this doesn't include doctors. The NHS doesn't exist. Healthcare isn't nationalised. So when you talk about the public sector, you can't include the medical profession. So the public sector here is teachers, civil servants and the armed forces. Remember I told you about the Invergordon Mutiny, which was where privates in the army were going to have their wages cut by 25%, and then officers were going to have their wages cut by 10%, and everyone was really annoyed, and then the government compromises. Anyway, the other super important thing is the 2% interest rate. So, like I said, coming off the gold standard is a good thing because it makes British goods more competitive. It makes British goods cheaper. Here, I don't necessarily mean like domestically. It's not going to make your stuff at home cheaper, but it makes British exports cheaper, which makes people want to buy them, which is a good thing. So this is an attempt to increase British exports, which will then hopefully end up either matching or overtaking the amount of stuff we're importing, which will then fix the balance of trade, which will then go some way to fixing the balance of payments and the massive deficit that we're in. However, we are not the only country that's coming off the gold standard. There's a bunch of other countries that are coming off the gold standard at the same time, which means their goods are also cheap, which means as much as British goods are more competitive, everyone else's goods are getting more competitive at the same time. So actually, in the grand scheme of things, British goods aren't that competitive compared to the international economy anyway. Now, in terms of the transfer of power, the last thing that Snowden really does as Chancellor of the Exchequer is coming off the gold standard. Snowden decides he doesn't want to stand in the November 31 election. He's kind of over it. He's over politics. He's just like, get me to my nice retirement, please and thank you. So he doesn't even stand as an MP. He's gone. And he is replaced by Neville Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain basically immediately introduces the import duties bill. So remember, a bill is a law before it's passed, and then it becomes an act when it is passed. And basically the suggestion is introduce a 10% tariffs on all goods entering Britain, exempt empire goods, so that would be things coming from places like India, because Chamberlain's intention here is to make the empire like a self-sustaining economic unit. So money is circulating within what I call the wider British economy, which is obviously the economy actually within Britain itself, but also empire. So Chamberlain wants to make it more appealing and more likely that people will buy goods from Britain or the empire than people buying from competing international economies like Germany or Britain. Germany or Britain, what am I talking about? Germany or France or America. Anyway, that freaks out Canada and Australia, and the Ottawa Conference in July 1932, and But basically, this happens. It sails through the House of Commons, and Britain finally introduces protectionism. But please do not overstate the extent to which protectionism has an impact on British economic recovery, because it really kind of doesn't. There's a much bigger benefit to, for example, coming off the gold standard than there is to introducing tariffs. So obviously the benefit of introducing tariffs is British companies are protected from competing international goods that might be cheaper, but the danger is that things like coal, steel and iron are more expensive for us to import. This is especially problematic because we're importing a bunch of stuff from countries that are more efficient than we are. So we're getting a bunch of steel from the Krupp steelworks in Germany and blah, 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 blah. So this is a problem because British industry is suffering. The staples are suffering hugely in the north. So, introducing tariffs does actually make British industrial production actually quite a bit harder. Stupid Chamberlain. No, I'm only joking, but still. Anyway, I struggle to think of a downside to this, so if you can think of one, let me know in the comments, because I'm a proper YouTuber now. But I struggle to think of a downside of dropping interest rates. But in mid-1932, interest rates had dropped quite significantly, actually. They dropped from 6% to 2%. And the huge benefit of this is what you call cheap money. So it's much, much cheaper to borrow money now, because you're paying way less back. This incentivizes people to invest in mortgages, which are quite a safe loan, because people pay their mortgage because they don't want to be homeless, and this is good for the banks because they're making a profit. And if obviously more people are taking out mortgages, that's more profit for the banks and stuff like that. It's also easier for industry to mechanise, so the intention here is to try and prompt staple industries to invest in mechanisation, particularly things like coal, and this will improve efficiency in production. But the massive downside, don't forget, is that this leads to unemployment, but we'll talk about that in a second. So yeah, if you can think of a downside of dropping interest rates, let me know, because I can't think of one, but it might just be me being dumb. Anyway, in terms of the wider economy then, government expenditure being cut in 31 is a good thing, because it stops the banking crisis from getting worse. It stops international banks from withdrawing from the economy. However, demand for British goods and services is lowered. And if you have lowered demand for goods and services, obviously that means lower supply, which then leads to lower consumer spending. So there is less money, I suppose, circulating within the British economy. No one's buying anything. No one can afford to buy anything, apart from if you live in the south, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So because of the interest rates being dropped, coal mining becomes more technologically advanced because people can buy, pneumatic drills and get stuff out of the earth more efficiently than a man called Jim and his pickaxe. But anyway, so coal mining becomes more technologically advanced, which means you need less people. This leads to rapidly increasing unemployment. So when we look in a second at unemployment statistics, you'll see that in the staple industries, particularly the coal industry, unemployment is very, very high. And that is an unfortunate downside of mechanisation. The only one here that I really want to talk about is the Cotton Industry Reorganisation Act. This is quite an important one 1936, the government tries to incentivise companies to invest in cotton factories by shutting down a bunch of really unproductive cotton mills. Because if you shut down all the really unproductive ones, that means cotton, like cotton cloth production in Britain, is being done by really efficient, productive mills, which then encourage investment. But the problem is, by closing down a bunch of unproductive mills, you've just rapidly increased unemployment in Lancashire. And this isn't the slightly easier to deal with cyclical unemployment, which recovers with like trade cycles. This is entrenched structural unemployment, and this isn't going to be fixed until the Labour government after the Second World War. So the Labour government of 45 to 51, when they start building a bunch of factories in this previously economically depressed north. So as much as this is a good thing for the economy in the big picture, this leads to rapid unemployment, which is a bad thing. A similar thing happens in County Durham. So there's a city called Jarrow in County Durham, and it's a shipbuilding town. And Palmer's shipyard shuts in 1933. And Jarrow as a town then struggles with 80% unemployment. So 80% of the working age population in Jarrow are unemployed. And again, this is structural unemployment. This is something that's only going to be fixed either A, when a private company opens a factory in Jarrow and provides work for all these people, or B, the government does the same thing, or C, the government starts investing in the new industries, moves them north, and basically reshapes how the economy in the north works and moves it away from staple industries. But obviously that does not happen in the 1930s. So people in Jarrow are really suffering with deeply entrenched unemployment. And this prompts the MP of Jarrow, Ellen Wilkinson, who, fun fact, Rachel Reeves, the current Chancellor of the Exchequer, has a portrait of Ellen Wilkinson in her office, which is interesting to me. Anyway, Ellen Wilkinson's the MP for Jarrow. She is not a communist, as much as people like to say she is. She's not a communist, but she is she's a committed socialist, and she writes a book called The Town That Was Murdered about Jarrow. And this title is very interesting because obviously murdered, it's not the town that died, it's the town that was murdered. And in this book, she accuses government neglect, or she accuses the government of neglect, and she says that they are responsible for the decline in living standards and employment levels in Jarrow, which, it's hard to argue with that. Now, the government does try and alleviate structural unemployment and tries to alleviate the terrible conditions in the north. In 1934 and 1937, they introduced something called the Special Areas Act. And the Special Areas Act designates certain places in the country as particularly depressed. So South Wales, North West, North East, Clydeside. So remember, Clydeside's Glasgow. North West, so that's Lancashire, textile mills. North East, coal. South Wales, coal. North East, also shipbuilding. And basically the government gives these areas £2 million to try and rejuvenate industry in these areas. This fails because £2 million is not enough to deal with entrenched structural unemployment, because you need to invest literally probably tens of millions of pounds trying to train up a bunch of people in that area to do a different job, and then create the facility for them to do that job by either like opening a factory or something like that. So the Special Areas Act really does kind of nothing. It does not fix the problem at all. And we see this by looking specifically at unemployment statistics. So in 1936, 30.6% of people who used to work in shipbuilding were unemployed. So 30.6% of the shipbuilding workers were not employed. In coal, it's 25%. And like I said, this is partly because of the mechanisation of the coal industry. Now, if you compare that to the new industries, so you've got the chemical trade, that only has 7% unemployment. and the financial sector and the invisible industries is only 3.8%. So we see that actually it is not possible to talk about the economic depression in Britain because it doesn't exist. The depression is a regional phenomena. You can talk about depressed areas in Britain, but you cannot talk about the depression, because actually there's evidence that places in the south, and maybe even as far up as the Midlands, for example, like Coventry, so places in the south like Bristol, London, Kent, they are doing quite well. Bristol's doing well because of aviation, London's doing well because of the financial sector and the car industry, because in 1931 you've got the Dagenham Ford factory that opens. The Midlands is also doing well because of the car industry. So this leads to something called the two nations theory, which is basically Britain. There is quite a distinct observable divide between how the north is doing and how the south is doing in terms of the economy. So if you ever get an essay question about the 1930s, I can't speak. If you ever get a question about the 1930s economy and you don't use the word regional, I will be very disappointed in you, because you need to address the fact that the depression doesn't exist. Anyway, keeping up with this whole unemployment thing, people who are unemployed for longer than a year rapidly increases. So by 1935, we have 26%, of people being unemployed for more than a year. That's a typo on my screen. It should say, hang on, I'll fix it now. By February 1938, it's 35% of people who have been unemployed for longer than a year. And we're not surprised that this long-term unemployment is in the staple industries: coal, steel, iron, textile, shipbuilding. And this leads to, like I've said about 6 million times, the phrase I want you to use: entrenched structural unemployment. It's deeply embedded within the economy and it's incredibly hard to deal with. Now, what the government introduces to deal with this rapidly increasing unemployment, or deal with the rapidly increasing unemployment levels, is something called the means test. And the means test is introduced in 1931, and it's one of the most hated policies of the 1930s, because the payments that are given to the unemployed are incredibly low, and the testing is really quite repressive and horrible. Because what would end up happening is someone from the Unemployment Assistance Board would come to your house and like look at how much stuff you had. And if you had extra stuff, they'd tell you to sell it. And it would take the entire household income. So if you had, like parents and like teenage children, and those teenage children were working, the income of the teenagers would count towards the household income. And that would lead to the household in general getting less benefits. So the means test would break up families by having these teenagers have to leave the house, so their income didn't count towards the household income, which is awful, actually. And you can understand why people referred to the national government as the National Hunger Government. And yeah, it is pretty terrible. I'm not going to talk you through that because I'm aware that I've been talking for a very long time. Now, in terms of agriculture, my argument is there isn't really that much positivity to talk about for agriculture for the entire course. Like, if you were to plot out agricultural developments between 1906 and 1957, it's basically a story of decline. And the decade of the 1930s obviously is no different. So wheat prices fall by 50%. Wheat becomes 50% cheaper, which means it's great for the consumer, but it's terrible for the producer. It's terrible for the farmer because their profits decrease by half. So farmers just abandon their land. They move to selling other products like cash crops. So they'll grow flowers, they'll grow tulips and stuff like that instead of growing food because they can get more money for it. So this is called arable farming. So like growing crops, they just don't do it anymore. So they might start growing fruit or raising poultry or stuff like that. So that leads to increased imports of things like grain, which is problematic because then that upsets our balance of trade, because then we end up importing more than we're exporting and we just end up back in the whole problem. So what the government tries to do is incentivize farmers to keep farming by encouraging them to mechanise, by introducing marketing boards to subsidise farmers for their lost profits, but also make sure that the price that the consumer is paying is not extraordinarily high. So it's basically trying to keep everybody happy. And we also have the soil improvement schemes. Could you even imagine anything more exciting than a soil improvement scheme? Basically, the soil improvement schemes are trying to deal with really crappy soil that isn't really soil, it's just like clay. And it's trying to make sure that as much land as possible is being turned into arable farming land, so we can stop having to import wheat from Ukraine, basically, and stop messing up our balance of trade. So the government spends a lot of money on agriculture. In total, across the 1930s, the government spends £100 million. And this goes to things such as the Milk Act of 1934, which subsidises school milk. This is great because that means that dairy farmers have a regular income, because the schools obviously need a reliable source of milk. And this is also good for kids because it means that the reality is, for some of these kids, the milk that they're getting at school is some of the only fresh food that they are consuming in a day. So that's positive. We also have subsidies for key food items like milk, bacon and potatoes, and access to cheap credit. So remember, in 1932, interest rates had dropped from 6% to 2%, making money cheaper to borrow. And that means that by 1937, we have 40,000 tractors in Britain. So these poor guys with their cart and their ladders and everything would probably benefit from a tractor. But I'm trying to make this sound positive and exciting, but it's just not, because the number of farm workers still falls by a third in the 1930s, and it was really low anyway, and it's just farming is on the decline. Farming is on the decline, like I say, from the beginning of the period to the end. There isn't really, I can't think off the top of my head of any real instance of farming improving, apart from, I suppose, the wars. Second World War, I think farming improves, but then after, it goes back to being crap, basically. How much have I got left to do? Oh, loads. I'm going to stop here for now, and I'll end up doing this again on another one, and I'll just splice them both together. So I'll leave it here for now, and I will see you again in just 1 second. Yesterday I spoke for 42 minutes, and then by the end of it I was doing the More to Live, so I'm going to finish it today. Going to talk about house building and culture and society and stuff like that. So let's kick off with the house building boom of the 1930s. So the house building boom is a good thing because it encourages economic growth in lots of different industries. So obviously, if you need a bunch of houses, that's going to provide jobs for the furniture industry, the revival of the construction industry, so bricklayers, plumbers, electricians, because in the 1930s we see a lot of houses now being connected to the national grid, which is a good thing, and allows for the purchasing of like convenience technologies and stuff like that. So the house building boom does stimulate the job market, which is a good thing. But something that's interesting and important for you lot to remember is that the majority of houses that are being built in the 1930s are built by private construction companies. And a lot of these private construction companies actually still exist. So like Taylor Wimpey, for example, still exists. So a lot of the houses, well, there's 2.1 million houses built in total in the 1930s. And the vast majority of these houses are privately built by the private sector. It's housing that is owned predominantly by the middle classes. And we don't see a huge amount of council houses being built. So when you talk about the house building boom, if you have a question about living standards in the 1930s, it is important that you recognise that as much as there is an increase in house building, compared to, for example, the 1920s, this is something that really does predominantly benefit the middle classes, because hang on, where is it? Like I said, there is 2.1 million houses built in the decade of the 1930s, but only just under 600,000 of those are local authority homes. So you might call those council houses or social housing or something like that. So again, make sure that you are acknowledging this real class divide in terms of living standards. We do have a Housing Act in the 1930s, so the Housing Act of 1935, that is specifically designated or specifically designed to address things like overcrowding and slums. So the Housing Act of 35 defines overcrowding officially by law as 2 or more persons per room. So if you had a 3-room house and you had 9 people living in there, that would be considered as a overcrowded house. And what the government finds out by applying this metric is that about 3.3% of houses are overcrowded. But the problem is, as much as it's okay, so great, these, you've got a family of 4 living in a 3-bedroom house. I keep doing that, a 3-room house. That's great. That's not overcrowded. However, the problem is, this Housing Act is not really taking much, it's not really placing any emphasis on like housing conditions or like living standards. So you've still got a bunch of people living in like Victorian tenement flats that are struggling with issues of sanitation and hygiene, poor construction, issues like subsidence and rising damp and mold and stuff like that. So as much as overcrowding is kind of dealt with in the 1930s, you've still got people living in slum housing. And the other problem is just over half of the houses that had been designated for demolition, because they were defined as slums, have actually been demolished. So you've still got a huge amount of housing that is deemed unfit for human habitation that is still being inhabited by people, and this has a significant impact on children and obviously people's health, developing lung conditions from mold inhalation and stuff like that. The other downside of the housing boom is because obviously we have a huge amount of private housing being built, and a lot of this is being built to be rented out to sort of young professionals at this point, I suppose, so young professional men. There is a problem that if council rent is too cheap, then people won't want to live in these private sector rental properties. And so the government makes an effort to keep council flat rates at around the same level as the private sector, which is problematic because that benefits the landlords, but it means that a lot of people who are living in council properties are paying over the odds for the sort of housing that they're living in. So when you talk about house building in the 1930s, in general, you need to talk about the fact that slums are still a huge problem, that the government is doing a lot to benefit the private landlord, and that as much as we do have a significant amount of houses built in the decade of the 1930s, the vast majority of these are benefiting the middle class private property owning class and not the working classes. Oh, why is only one of them? Okay. Anyway, in terms of living standards more broadly then, by the end of the 1930s, you've got 9 million houses connected to the national grid, which is good. Because, like I said earlier, this allows for the purchasing of things like convenience technologies, so Hoovers, early forms of the vacuum cleaner and stuff like that. And in theory, this domestic electricity supply benefits women. And the reason I put benefit in quotation marks there is because it is still, common practice to assume that women will hold responsibility for household labour. So yeah, fair enough. The the Hoover is making it easier for them to clean their houses, but it's still them who's cleaning the house, and the man is still, going to work and living in the the public sector, and blah 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 blah. We also have a kind of tiny-ish increase in car owners. Remember that Britain is a low-wage economy. We don't have a particularly huge demand for cars domestically because we just simply can't afford them, and that also includes the sort of middle and upper classes. And a bunch of the cars that are being produced in Britain are being exported over to Europe. So by 1938, we've got about 2 million car owners, which isn't that many, but it is an increase quite significantly from previous decades. So we've got 2 Ford factories in Britain by this point. We've got the Ford factory in Manchester that opens in 1913, and then we've got the Ford factory in Dagenham in London, which opens in 1931. Alongside electrification and the connection of houses to the national grid, you've got about 70% of households that have a wireless license by the end of the decade. So they're listening to radio. So it changes the way that people consume entertainment. So you've got radio plays, music, and it also changes the way that people interact with politics. So there's a lot more political broadcasts, and it allows people to feel more connected to the wider world because of news broadcasts on the radio and stuff like that. We also have the growth of the publishing industry, so the development of the publishing house Penguin, public libraries. You've also got the work of things like the Left Book Club in the 1930s. Penguin Publishers, I think, opens in 1925. And they are producing quite a lot of paperbacks by this point. Particularly, we've already looked at people like J.B. Priestley and George Orwell, but there's also a bunch of other books that are being published by Penguin that I'll talk to you about in a second. The cinema industry is a very interesting one when you're talking about living standards, because actually the cinema is quite an accessible form of entertainment for the working class because the tickets are so cheap. And we see the rise of the cinema going population increase quite dramatically. In 1924, you've got about 36,000 people going to the cinema per year, but by 1935, about 10 years later, that's 8 million people going to the cinema per year. A bunch of the films that are being shown in the cinemas in the 1930s are American, which raises problems of sort of Americanization of British culture, and there's quite a big pushback from the countercultural movement spearheaded by people like Orwell and Priestley, but we'll talk about that more in a second. Cinema becomes a lot more popular because of the development of the so-called talkies. So the first talkie is in 1927, and a talkie is basically what it sounds like. It's a talking film. So instead of being a silent film, it actually has people speaking. So that makes the cinema more interesting, more exciting. And so in order to sort of address the problem of Americanization, the government puts into place a requirement in 1936 that 20% of films that are shown in British cinemas have to be British made in order not to sort of lose traditional Britishness and sort of, I don't know, have Britain be too Yankified, or however you want to phrase it. And like I say, the cinema audiences are predominantly made up of the working classes because the tickets are so affordable that actually even people who are on means tested benefits can attend the cinema because it's quite that cheap. So again, if you're talking about living standards in the 1930s, you can acknowledge that actually the cinema is evidence that the living standards of the working poor are improving because they're able to access entertainment at the cinema. Remember, in the 1930s, the cinema would operate quite differently to how it does today. So when you go to the cinema today, you sit through a bunch of adverts, and then you sit through a bunch of trailers, and then you watch the film. But in the 1930s, there'd be a bunch of different little programs, and you might see a hand-drawn cartoon or something, and oftentimes you'd watch a news broadcast, or you might see something from the Prime Minister. So even going to Peace in Our Time in 1938, the Peace in Our Time speech was broadcast in a bunch of cinemas before like the actual film was being showed. So remember that the cinema is actually it serves quite a different social purpose than it does today, which is interesting. And there's loads you can talk about here in an exam if you've got a question about 1930s living standards. Now, in terms of the actual family in the 1930s, because of the provision of free contraception to women, obviously married women, family sizes are reduced. So instead of having 3, 4, 5, 6 kids, the 2-child family becomes the norm. And 1933, interestingly, is the year with the lowest birth rate of the 1930s. So we see the development of the 2-child family, and it's this really romantic sort of idealized vision of the father, the mother, the son and the daughter, and that becomes something that a lot of people really are trying to strive for. And another reason that people are having less children is not just women actually being able to have bodily autonomy, it's also for cost reasons. So having a very large family in the 1930s is incredibly expensive. And so the development of contraception is useful because it allows women to have, or like husbands and wives to have smaller families, and then there's less mouths to feed. And a lot of these smaller families, so the mother and the father and the 2 children, would go on holiday. So we have the opening of Butlins in 1936 in Skegness. And Butlins is opened by a man called Billy Butlin. Look him up. He has quite an interesting background. And in 1938, the government rewards the working classes with the Holidays with Pay Act, which entitles the working classes to a week's paid holiday. Now, to us, that sounds pathetic and almost insulting. And if you only had a week off work every year, you'd be driven to distraction. But actually, this is quite significant because this is the first time that the British public are able to engage in leisure activities whilst also still being paid by their employer. So Butlins becomes more popular, especially after 1938. And yeah. So again, living standards. You could talk about how the Holidays with Pay Act does benefit the working classes. The working classes are able to save up and go to somewhere like Butlins on holiday. The fact that by 1939, 11 million people are entitled to free holidays. Sorry, not free holidays, I'm talking rubbish. 11 million people are entitled to a week off work paid. So again, this has a significantly positive impact on people's quality of life, people's standards of living. I'm not going to talk to you about that. The important one is that average real wage is rising. So the real wage is actually like the purchasing power of your money. So between 24 and 35, you might expect real wages to decrease, but they actually increase by 17% on average. Now, this is kind of undercut by vaguely high taxation, but it does mean that people's quality of life, whilst not improving rapidly, it's not decreasing at such a horrific level. The final thing I want to talk to you a little bit about is 1930s culture. So the guy on the right-hand side, I'm hoping you'll recognise him. This is J.B. Priestley. And Priestley is critical of 1930s culture. He is critical of consumerism. He's critical of Americanization and the sort of pacifying effect that has on the working class and middle class in terms of their engagement with politics. And when he's talking about the 1930s Britain, he says, "This is the England of arterial and bypass roads, of filling stations and factories that look like exhibition buildings, factory girls that looked like actresses, of giant cinemas and dance halls and cafes and bungalows with tiny garages, cocktail bars, Woolworths, motor coaches, and everything given away for cigarette coupons." So he's being quite dismissive and quite disparaging here of 1930s culture. So he's not saying that the factory girls that look like actresses, he's not saying, oh, that's a good thing because they look beautiful. He's saying that it's a farce that you've got these working class women who are doing pretty dire jobs in factories, but they're all dolled up to look like Greta Gable, for example. And he's not the only person that is quite radically critical of 1930s culture. We've also got George Orwell, but I'll come to him in just one second. So, why is my laptop broken? Why is it doing this? Oh, I fixed it. Okay, it's just been weird. Anyway, so in terms of 1930s culture then, like I've said, there is the concern about consumerism, Americanization, and the concern that increased contact of the British working class to consumerism is going to kind of nullify their intelligence or stop them from engaging in politics properly. And Priestley has a really, really big problem with this. So he talks about the degraded quality of journalism. This is my phrase, so the sexiness of the media. I'm not talking about pornography here. What I'm talking about is the fact that you've got a bunch of like salacious headlines, scandalous mass media stories. It's really the development of like celebrity culture. And instead of publishing news articles about important stuff about politics and justice and the economy, a lot of tabloid newspapers are now producing these like sexy stories about celebrities. And Priestley has a real problem with this, and he talks about the quality of British journalism being degraded by mass culture and particularly mass Americanization. And the text that I want you to know for this course is English Journey. So English Journey, we've read sections of this in class, but just if you can't remember, English Journey is basically Priestley travelling around the country and interacting with different people in different areas. And he is particularly interested in the disparity between the South. And so he talks, for example, about where I'm from, Bristol. He talks about how places like Bristol are full of happy people and how everyone seems quite affluent. And then he goes up to where we live now, up in the northwest, and he's quite horrified by what he sees. He actually goes to Jarrow and he talks about massive slag heaps and the abandonment of traditional industry, and he talks about what he calls the two Englands, or the three Englands actually. He talks about the bustling suburbia of the South. He talks about the ancient neglected rural South, and then the rapidly dying industrial North. So you've got these urban centres in the South in places like Bristol and London, and then you've got the ancient neglected rural South in like Devon and Cornwall, and then you've got the rapidly dying industrial North, so that would be the Northwest, the Northeast, even up into like Clydeside, Glasgow, Belfast. And he says that the only way that society can make progress and society can be ameliorated is by dismantling the class system and implementing socialism and collective responsibility and collectivization and stuff like that. These beliefs are also held by George Orwell. Orwell is probably one of the most vocal anti-consumerist countercultural voices in the 1930s. You'll know Orwell. We've looked at Road to Wigan Pier, but you'll also know 1984, Animal Farm, Down and Out in Paris and London and stuff like that. So he is also really concerned about Americanization and American culture, and he talks about how movies in particular have prevented like a proper British Revolution. We can criticize this by arguing that actually Britain is not full of revolutionaries at all, and it's not just, we're watching American movies that's stopping us from staging like a Russia-esque revolution. It's actually the nature of British moderacy that's prevented that. But he's very disparaging towards the working classes, actually, and that puts a lot of people off because he's very negative about them. And he says there is no sheep, there is only flock. Sorry, I'm talking rubbish. He says there is no mob, there is only flock. So he's like, we don't have this mob mentality anymore. we don't have enough class consciousness. There's no revolutionary spirit or appetite amongst the British. We've just become a flock of sheep who are just content being told what to do. And this quote is quite earlier I said Greta Gable, it's Greta Garbo. Getting them confused. Anyway, so he says, you may have only 3 halfpence in your pocket and not a prospect in the world, and only the corner of a leaky bedroom to go home to, but in your new clothes you can stand on the street corner, indulging in a private daydream of yourself as Clark Gable or Greta Garbo, which compensates you for a great deal. He is taking the mick here. He is calling the working classes delusional. He's like, look at the state of your life, and then look at the fact that you're standing there pretending that you're these fantastic actors, these celebrities of the 1930s, and actually you're going to go home to the corner of a leaky bedroom, and actually the quality of your life is really, really poor, but you're just completely distracted. So instead of trying to hold the government to account for the crappy state of your life, you are just swanning around engaging with mass media and sort of switching your brain off. So yeah, that's the 1930s. AQA love asking questions about the 1930s. The 1930s has come... Ooh, what happened there? The 1930s has come up every single year, actually, on the exam, either in terms of living standards or the economy or threats to stability. So the BUF, the CPGB and abdication crisis. Obviously, I can't predict anything, and I'm not going to try and predict a question, but based off the past, it would be useful for you to be quite on it in terms of the 1930s. But obviously, this could be the year where they don't ask anything about the 1930s, so you never know. Anyway, this has ended up being basically an hour, so well done for sitting through it all if you have. Drop me a comment if you've watched the whole thing. I'm only joking. Anyway, let me know if you want me to do any more, and I shall see you in the next one.